The rain was relentless that evening, cold, heavy, and unyielding, drenching the city streets of Chicago as if the sky itself mourned. Jonathan Clark pressed a trembling hand against the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, watching the storm consume everything below. His breath fogged the glass as memories he'd tried to bury clawed their way to the surface, each raindrop a reminder of that terrible night 7 years ago when everything changed forever. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're looking at an old photograph or remembering something you lost long ago. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your soul. 43 floors above the chaos, Jonathan's world existed in perfect, suffocating silence. The penthouse stretched endlessly before him. Marble floors that reflected nothing but emptiness. Italian leather furniture that had never felt the warmth of companionship, and walls adorned with priceless art that might as well have been blank canvases for all the joy they brought. But it was the wall of antique clocks that truly told his story. 17 timepieces from around the world, each one frozen at 3:17 a.m., the exact moment the doctors had walked into that sterile hospital waiting room and shattered his universe with 4 simple words: "We did everything possible." The scent of expensive cologne couldn't mask the staleness that had settled into every corner of his life. His fortune, built through decades of ruthless real estate investments across Chicago's most coveted properties, had grown to astronomical proportions. His portfolio included everything from downtown skyscrapers to luxury condominiums along Lake Michigan, with assets diversified across traditional investments and even cryptocurrency holdings that had multiplied his wealth beyond imagination. Yet tonight, surrounded by the fruits of his financial empire, Jonathan felt poorer than the homeless man he'd seen shivering on Lower Wacker Drive. His fingers traced the edge of a silver picture frame, the only photograph he couldn't bear to put away. Elena smiled back at him, her dark eyes sparkling with the laughter that once filled these empty rooms. She had been his anchor, his reason for building this empire, his reminder that beneath the calculating businessman beat the heart of a man capable of profound love. The accident had stolen more than just her life. It had stolen his ability to believe in anything beyond the cold certainty of profit margins and quarterly returns. The intercom buzzed, startling him from his reverie. "Mr. Clark, your car is ready whenever you are, sir." Marcus, his driver for the past 8 years, had learned not to expect much conversation during these late-night journeys through the city. Jonathan grabbed his custom-tailored coat and headed for the private elevator, each step echoing in the cavernous space like a countdown to nowhere. The streets of Chicago blurred past the bulletproof windows of his black Mercedes as they moved through the financial district toward the south side. Rain hammered against the roof with increasing intensity, creating a rhythm that seemed to match the restless beating of his heart. He had no particular destination in mind. These drives had become a ritual, a way to fill the hours between sunset and the sleepless dawn that would inevitably follow. The city's pulse thrummed around him, millions of lives intersecting and diverging in patterns he no longer felt connected to. As they slowed at a traffic light near Bronzeville, Jonathan's attention was caught by a small figure standing beneath a flickering street lamp. Through the rain-streaked window, he could make out a boy, no more than 8 years old, wearing clothes that hung loose on his thin frame. The child stood perfectly still despite the storm raging around him, as if he were waiting for something, or someone. What struck Jonathan most was the boy's posture, not defeated or afraid, but patient and strangely peaceful, like a small lighthouse weathering the storm with quiet dignity. Something about the scene pierced through Jonathan's carefully constructed emotional armor. Without thinking, he found himself instructing Marcus to pull over, then stepping out into the downpour. The cold rain immediately soaked through his expensive suit, but he barely noticed as he approached the child with an umbrella that felt inadequate against the storm's fury. Up close, he could see the boy's lips were blue with cold, his small hands red and raw from the wind, yet his amber eyes held a warmth that seemed impossible given his circumstances. "Are you all right, kid?" Jonathan asked, his voice rougher than intended, not expecting much of an answer from someone so young and obviously in distress. But when the boy looked up at him, really looked at him, Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the ice that had formed around his heart. The child's gaze was direct and unafraid, holding depths of understanding that seemed to belong to someone much older. "I'm waiting for God," David said simply, his young voice carrying clearly despite the storm. "He said he'd come for me tonight." The words hit Jonathan like a physical blow, not because of their strangeness, but because of the absolute certainty with which they were spoken. This wasn't the desperate plea of a child in need. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt. Jonathan's first instinct was to laugh. Here was a boy, soaked to the skin and shivering on one of Chicago's most dangerous corners, talking about divine appointments as if discussing the weather. His fortune had been built on facts, figures, and the reliable selfishness of human nature. He'd learned long ago that faith was a luxury for people who hadn't experienced real loss, a crutch for those who couldn't face the harsh realities of an indifferent universe. Yet something in David's manner prevented the dismissive chuckle from escaping his throat. "God!" Jonathan managed, his business-trained skepticism warring with an unfamiliar stirring in his chest. "Son, I think you might be waiting a while. It's late, and this isn't exactly a safe neighborhood." The boy's response was a gentle smile that seemed to illuminate his face despite the darkness surrounding them. "Sometimes God wears the face of someone who doesn't expect anything," David replied, his small hand reaching out to touch Jonathan's sleeve with startling boldness. The simple gesture sent an electric shock through the millionaire's system, as if he'd been touched by something far more powerful than a child's frozen fingers. The rational part of Jonathan's mind insisted this was nothing more than a street-smart kid working an elaborate con, perhaps coached by adults who'd spotted an expensive car and seen opportunity. But looking into David's eyes, Jonathan found no calculation, no hidden agenda. Only an innocence so pure it made his chest ache with something he'd forgotten how to name. For the first time in 7 years, the careful walls he'd built around his emotions began to show hairline cracks. Without fully understanding why, Jonathan found himself making a decision that would have seemed impossible just minutes earlier. He couldn't leave this child standing in the storm, regardless of what strange beliefs motivated his vigil. "Come on," he said, surprising himself with the gentleness in his voice. "Let's get you somewhere warm and dry. Then we can figure out what to do about your appointment." As they walked toward the car, Jonathan couldn't shake the feeling that he was the one being rescued, though from what, he couldn't say. The boy's presence beside him felt both foreign and familiar, like encountering a language he'd once spoken fluently but had forgotten through disuse. Marcus raised an eyebrow as they approached the Mercedes, but 8 years of employment had taught him not to question his employer's occasional eccentricities. During the drive to find David's home, the child spoke softly about his mother, a nurse who worked double shifts to keep food on their table. He mentioned his father only once, referring to him as someone who went to be with Jesus when I was little, with the same matter-of-fact acceptance he'd shown while waiting in the storm. Jonathan found himself studying the boy's reflection in the window, searching for some explanation for the peace that seemed to radiate from such a small form. When they finally pulled up in front of a modest apartment building on the south side, Jonathan felt an unexpected reluctance to let this strange encounter end. As David prepared to leave the warm sanctuary of the car, he turned back to the millionaire with those impossibly wise eyes. "Thank you for stopping," he said. "I knew he would send someone." Before Jonathan could ask what he meant, the boy was gone, disappearing into the building like a small angel returning to wherever angels go when their work is done. The ride back to his penthouse passed in contemplative silence, Chicago's glittering skyline welcoming him back to his world of steel and glass and carefully calculated distances. But something had changed in the space between leaving and returning, something that made the marble floors feel less solid and the silence less complete. That night, for the first time in years, Jonathan found himself staring at the ceiling instead of the financial reports that usually occupied his sleepless hours. The child's words echoed in his mind like a song he couldn't quite remember. Sometimes God wears the face of someone who doesn't expect anything. As dawn broke over Lake Michigan, painting his penthouse in shades of gold and possibility, Jonathan Clark realized that his carefully ordered world had been visited by something he'd forgotten existed: mystery, wonder, and the dangerous possibility that maybe, just maybe, miracles still happen to those foolish enough to believe in them. The following days passed with unusual restlessness for Jonathan. His normal routine of morning market reports, afternoon property inspections, and evening board meetings continued unchanged, yet everything felt different. Colors seemed more vivid, sounds more distinct, as if someone had adjusted the settings on his reality. He found his attention wandering during client presentations, his mind returning to amber eyes and a voice that spoke of God as casually as other children might mention a favorite toy. His assistant, Margaret, noticed the change immediately. After 15 years of managing his schedule with military precision, she'd learned to read his moods like weather patterns. "You seem distracted lately, Mr. Clark," she observed during their morning briefing, her maternal concern breaking through professional boundaries. "Is everything all right?" Jonathan paused in his review of the quarterly investment portfolio, his pen hovering over figures that represented more wealth than most people could comprehend. How could he explain that he'd been undone by a child's simple faith? That his empire of real estate holdings, stock options, and cryptocurrency investments suddenly felt as insubstantial as morning mist. "Just thinking about diversification strategies," he lied, returning his attention to the endless columns of numbers that once brought him such satisfaction. But wealth, he was discovering, made a poor substitute for wonder. His penthouse, with its museum-quality art collection and technology that anticipated his every need, felt more like a mausoleum than a home. The frozen clocks seemed to mock him with their stubborn rejection of time's passage, as if they too were waiting for something that might never come. Even his favorite Monet, a water lily painting that had cost him 8 figures at auction, seemed flat and lifeless compared to the memory of a child's smile in the rain. It was Margaret who inadvertently provided the excuse he'd been searching for. "The quarterly charity allocations need your approval," she said, placing a folder on his desk filled with requests from various organizations. Jonathan had always approached philanthropy as another business decision, carefully calculated donations that provided tax benefits while maintaining his public image. But as he scanned the applications, one caught his attention: a small community center in Bronzeville requesting funds for after-school programming. The address was familiar, just 3 blocks from where he'd found David standing in the storm. Without analyzing his motivations too closely, Jonathan found himself approving not just the requested amount, but 10 times more, with instructions that the funds should be used specifically for programs serving the neighborhood's most vulnerable children. It wasn't enough to simply write a check, though. Something compelled him to see the impact of his investment firsthand. The community center was nothing like the sterile conference rooms where Jonathan usually conducted business. The walls were painted in bright, cheerful colors, covered with children's artwork and inspirational messages written in crayon. The air hummed with activity: teenagers practicing basketball in the gym, elderly residents playing chess in quiet corners, mothers watching their toddlers navigate a playground that had seen better days but radiated love and care. It was chaos compared to his ordered existence, yet it felt more alive than anywhere he'd been in years. And there, in the corner of the main room, sat David at a small table with crayons scattered before him, his tongue poking out in concentration as he worked on a drawing. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as their eyes met across the crowded space. The boy's face lit up with a smile that seemed to illuminate the entire room, as if he'd been expecting this meeting all along. "Mr. Clark," David called out, abandoning his artwork to run across the room. His enthusiasm was infectious, causing several other children to look up from their activities with curious expressions. "I knew you'd come. Mama said rich people don't like places like this, but I told her you were different." The casual way David spoke about his wealth should have been off-putting, but instead it felt refreshing, a child's honesty cutting through years of careful social positioning. Jonathan found himself kneeling to meet David's eye level, something he couldn't remember doing in decades of business dealings. "What are you drawing?" he asked, genuinely curious about the colorful creation the boy had abandoned. David's eyes sparkled with excitement as he led Jonathan back to his table. The drawing was simple but profound, a large tree with deep roots and broad branches, its leaves rendered in every shade of green the crayon box contained. Beneath its canopy stood two figures, a tall man in a dark suit and a small boy, their hands connected by what looked like a beam of golden light. "It's you and me," David explained with the matter-of-fact honesty that seemed to be his trademark. "The tree is God's love and the light is how we're connected now." He looked up at Jonathan with those impossibly wise eyes. Sometimes people think they're alone, but they're really just standing too far away from the tree to feel its shade. Jonathan stared at the simple artwork, his throat tightening with emotions he'd spent 7 years learning to suppress. How could an 8-year-old child understand truths that had eluded him despite all his education and experience? The drawing seemed to pulse with meaning, each childish stroke carrying weight that his millions of dollars couldn't purchase. "David?" A woman's voice interrupted the moment, tinged with concern and protective instinct. Jonathan looked up to see a woman approaching their table, her nurse's scrubs suggesting she'd come directly from work. She was pretty despite her obvious exhaustion, with concerned dark eyes that held both strength and wariness. This had to be Maria, David's mother, the woman who worked double shifts to provide for her remarkable son. "Mama!" David jumped up, wrapping his arms around his mother's waist. "This is Mr. Clark, the man I told you about. He came to see our community center." "Yeah." Maria's expression grew more guarded as she took in Jonathan's expensive suit and the unconscious authority that wealth had taught him to project. In her world, men like him usually meant trouble. Landlords raising rent, developers pushing out longtime residents, or do-gooders whose charity came with strings attached. "Mr. Clark," she said politely but coolly, "David mentioned meeting you. I hope he wasn't bothering you." "Not at all," Jonathan replied, rising to his full height and immediately regretting how the gesture emphasized the differences between them. "He's a remarkable child. You should be very proud." "I am," Maria said simply, her hand resting protectively on David's shoulder. But her eyes never left Jonathan's face, trying to read his intentions, to understand what a millionaire real estate developer wanted with her son. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and careful assessments. David, oblivious to the adult undercurrents, tugged on his mother's hand. "Mama, can Mr. Clark come to dinner? I made enough macaroni and cheese for 100 people." His innocent invitation hung in the air like a bridge spanning two very different worlds. Maria's instinctive response was clearly going to be no. Jonathan could see it in her eyes, the protective mother's rejection of something that felt too strange, too risky. But something in her son's expression, perhaps the hope that radiated from his small face, made her pause. We don't have much," she said carefully. "Just simple food in a small apartment." "I'd be honored," Jonathan heard himself say, the words surprising him as much as they did Maria. When was the last time he'd eaten a home-cooked meal? When had he last sat at someone else's table, not as a business associate or investor, but simply as a guest? The thought both terrified and thrilled him. Maria's apartment was a study in making much from little. The furniture was second-hand, but carefully maintained, the walls decorated with David's artwork and family photographs that spoke of love and loss and resilience. The scent of comfort food filled the small space: macaroni and cheese, green beans from a can, and cornbread that had been baked with more hope than ingredients. It was a meal that probably cost less than Jonathan typically spent on wine, yet it tasted richer than anything prepared by his private chef. As they ate around a small table that brought them close together despite their differences, Jonathan found himself talking in ways he hadn't in years. David's questions were simple but profound. What made him happy? Did he ever get lonely in his big house? Why did he work so much if he already had enough money? Each innocent inquiry stripped away another layer of the protective persona Jonathan had constructed around his wounded heart. "I used to think having enough money would solve every problem," he admitted, as David helped clear the dishes, the boy's small hands careful with the mismatched plates. "But I've learned that some things can't be purchased." "Like love," David said matter-of-factly, as if stating an obvious truth. "Mama says love is free, but it costs everything." The child's wisdom, delivered so casually while washing dishes in a kitchen sink, hit Jonathan with the force of revelation. As the evening wound down, Jonathan found himself reluctant to return to his penthouse fortress. The simple warmth of this small apartment had awakened something in him that he'd thought permanently lost. A hunger for connection, for belonging, for something beyond the endless accumulation of assets and achievements. When David hugged him goodbye, his small arms barely reaching around Jonathan's waist, the millionaire felt tears threatening for the first time since Elena's funeral. "Will you come back?" David asked, looking up with those amber eyes that seemed to see straight through to Jonathan's soul. "I have more drawings to show you, and Mama makes really good pancakes on Saturday mornings." "If your mother doesn't mind," Jonathan replied, glancing at Maria, who seemed caught between protective instinct and something softer, perhaps recognition of her son's gift for seeing good in unexpected places. "We'll see," was all she said, but the words carried possibility that hadn't been there at the beginning of the evening. As Jonathan walked to his waiting car, he could hear David's voice calling from the window above. "Thank you for coming to dinner. I told God you would." The drive back to his penthouse passed too quickly, returning him to marble floors and silent luxury and clocks that refused to move. But something fundamental had shifted in Jonathan's carefully controlled universe. For the first time in 7 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy, and the future didn't seem quite so predetermined. A child's simple faith had cracked something open in his heart, and light was beginning to seep in around the edges. That night, instead of reviewing market reports, Jonathan stood before the wall of frozen clocks and really looked at them, not as symbols of his loss, but as monuments to time wasted in grief. Elena would have loved David, would have seen in the boy's wisdom the same miracle that was beginning to transform her husband's heart. For the first time since the accident, Jonathan allowed himself to imagine what she might say if she could see him now, standing on the threshold of something he didn't yet understand but desperately wanted to explore. In the weeks that followed, Jonathan found reasons to visit the community center with increasing frequency. His initial donation had been transformed into a comprehensive renovation project, new playground equipment, updated computer labs, and a library filled with books that sparkled with newness. But his true motivation wasn't the satisfaction of philanthropic impact. It was the opportunity to spend time with a child who seemed to possess an understanding of life's deepest mysteries. David never seemed surprised by these visits, greeting Jonathan with the same warm enthusiasm, whether he appeared after 3 days or 3 hours. Their conversations ranged from the profound to the mundane, discussions about God and goodness interspersed with passionate debates about the Cubs' chances in the upcoming season. David approached both topics with equal seriousness, as if divine mysteries and baseball statistics deserved the same careful consideration. "Do you know why I like you, Mr. Clark?" David asked one afternoon as they sat in the center's newly renovated garden, watching other children play on equipment that Jonathan's money had provided. The question caught the millionaire off guard, partly because he'd begun to wonder the same thing about himself. "Why's that?" Jonathan asked, setting aside the tablet where he'd been reviewing his cryptocurrency portfolio, investments that had multiplied exponentially but felt increasingly meaningless. "Because you listen with your whole face," David replied, his small hands carefully tending to a plant they'd potted together. "Most grown-ups listen with just their ears, but you listen with your eyes and your heart too." The observation was delivered with David's characteristic matter-of-factness, but it hit Jonathan with unexpected force. When had he stopped listening with his whole face? When had he learned to divide his attention between the person speaking and the next deal, the next opportunity, the next way to multiply his already vast fortune? Elena used to complain about that. His ability to nod and make appropriate sounds while his mind calculated profit margins and construction timelines. He'd promised to change, of course, but had never quite managed to keep that promise before life stole away the opportunity. "You remind me of someone I used to know," Jonathan said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. He no longer tried to hide around this remarkable child. Someone who saw the best in everyone. David looked up from his planting, soil smudged on his cheek but his eyes bright with curiosity. "Was she your wife? The lady in the picture on your desk?" Jonathan's breath caught. He'd never mentioned Elena to David, never spoken of the photograph that graced his office overlooking the Chicago River. "How did you—" "Mama took me to your office building once when she had to deliver papers for her friend who works there," David explained casually. "I saw you through the window, looking at the picture and being sad. I prayed for you to not be so sad anymore." The simplicity of it, a child's prayer offered for a stranger's grief, overwhelmed Jonathan with its pure generosity. "Yes," he managed. "She was my wife. Her name was Elena." "She must have been really special," David said, returning his attention to the plant, but continuing the conversation with the easy flow that made him such an extraordinary companion. "I bet she's proud of you for helping all the kids here." "I don't know about that," Jonathan replied honestly. "I think she might be disappointed that it took me so long to remember what really matters." David considered this for a moment, his young face serious with concentration. "Maybe she's just happy you remembered it all. Mama says it's never too late to start being who you're supposed to be." That evening, as Jonathan sat in his penthouse surrounded by the trappings of his financial empire, investment reports, real estate contracts, and digital displays showing his various holdings, he found himself seeing his world through different eyes. The expensive art on his walls told stories of beauty created by human hands, not just monetary value. The view from his windows encompassed neighborhoods where families like David and Maria created richness from love rather than assets. For the first time since Elena's death, he opened the windows and let the sounds of the city fill his perfect silence. Car horns and distant music, laughter from the street below, and the hum of life continuing despite losses and setbacks. It all flowed into his carefully controlled environment like promise of reconnection with the world he'd shut out. The wall of frozen clocks no longer seemed like a shrine to his grief, but rather a reminder of time that could still be reclaimed. Elena had loved those clocks, collecting them from their travels around the world: Prague, Tokyo, London, Morocco. Each timepiece told the story of moments they'd shared, discoveries they'd made together, dreams they'd built for a future that had been cut short. But David's presence in his life was teaching him that dreams didn't have to die with the dreamer. They could be transformed, redirected, given new purpose and meaning. That night, Jonathan did something he hadn't done in 7 years. He wound one of the clocks, an intricate piece from Switzerland that Elena had fallen in love with during their anniversary trip. As its hands began to move for the first time since that terrible night in the hospital, he felt something in his chest move as well, a subtle shifting of pieces that had been frozen too long. Time, it seemed, was ready to flow again in the life of Jonathan Clark. The transformation wasn't immediate or dramatic. Instead, it unfolded gradually, like a flower opening to sunlight after a long winter. Jonathan found himself making decisions that would have seemed incomprehensible just months earlier, choosing dinner with David and Maria over high-stakes business dinners, spending Saturday mornings in the community center's garden instead of reviewing quarterly reports, laughing at a child's jokes with genuine delight rather than polite obligation. His business associates noticed the change, of course, Marcus commenting that he smiled more during their drives through the city. Margaret observing that he seemed lighter somehow, less burdened by the weight of responsibilities that had once consumed him. Even his investment advisor mentioned that Jonathan seemed less focused on maximizing every possible return, more interested in ensuring his wealth served purposes beyond mere accumulation. "You're different," Maria observed one evening, as they walked home from the community center, David skipping ahead of them with the boundless energy of childhood. The late summer air was warm and gentle, filled with the sense of barbecue from nearby residential streets and the distant sound of music from someone's radio. When we first met, you seemed, I don't know how to put it, like you were carrying something too heavy. Jonathan considered her words as they paused at a crosswalk, watching David chat animatedly with an elderly man walking his dog. I was, he admitted. I think I still am, but somehow it doesn't feel quite so heavy anymore. David has that effect on people, Maria said, with the deep love and slight bewilderment of a mother trying to understand her extraordinary child. Sometimes I think he sees things the rest of us miss, possibilities where we only see limitations. As if summoned by their conversation, David bounded back to them, his face glowing with excitement. Mrs. Henderson says her grandson is coming to visit next week, and he's exactly my age. She wants to know if we can have a welcome party in the community center. Can we, Mr. Clark? Can we make it really special? The request was so typically David, more concerned with making someone else feel welcome than with what he might get from the situation. Jonathan found himself already mentally planning the celebration, thinking about decorations and food and ways to make a young visitor feel at home in a new place. When had other people's happiness become his instinctive priority? Of course, he said, ruffling David's hair in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing. We'll make it a party he'll never forget. That night, as Jonathan reviewed his financial portfolio, real estate holdings worth hundreds of millions, investment funds that generated more income in a month than most people saw in a lifetime, cryptocurrency positions that had multiplied beyond his wildest projections, he realized that for the first time in years, his wealth felt like a tool rather than a trophy. Money, he was learning, could buy more than luxury and security. It could purchase hope, opportunity, and the chance to see children's faces light up with joy. The party for Mrs. Henderson's grandson turned into a neighborhood celebration, with families Jonathan had never met bringing potluck dishes and homemade desserts. He found himself in conversations about everything except business, discussing the Cubs' season with devoted fans, learning about community garden projects from residents who'd transformed vacant lots into sources of fresh produce, listening to stories of struggles and triumphs from people who measured wealth in terms of family, faith, and friendship. As the evening wound down and he helped clean up after the festivities, Jonathan caught sight of himself in the community center's mirror. The man looking back was still recognizable, well-dressed, successful, bearing the unmistakable marks of privilege and power. But something in his eyes had changed, a warmth that hadn't been there for 7 long years, a sense of purpose that went beyond the next acquisition or investment opportunity. "Thank you," David said as they loaded leftover cake into containers for families to take home. "This was the best party ever, and I've been to a lot of parties." His serious tone suggested this was high praise indeed from someone who'd experienced numerous childhood celebrations. "Thank you," Jonathan replied, and meant it more deeply than the child could possibly understand. "You've given me more than I could ever give you." David looked up at him with those remarkable amber eyes, his young face serious with consideration. "I think maybe that's how friendship works. We keep giving each other things we didn't know we needed, and somehow we both end up with more than we started with." 8 years old, and he understood the mathematics of love better than most adults ever would. As Jonathan drove home through the Chicago evening, past the towers of steel and glass that bore his name and contained his business empire, he realized that David was right. He had more than he'd started with, not in terms of monetary wealth, but in ways that mattered more than any portfolio could measure. The frozen clocks in his penthouse had all started ticking again, their gentle rhythm now marking moments of connection rather than loss. Elena's photograph still graced his desk, but when he looked at it now, he saw not just grief for what had ended, but gratitude for what had been, and hope for what still might be. Love, he was beginning to understand, didn't die with the beloved. It transformed, finding new expressions and unexpected recipients. That night, for the first time since Elena's accident, Jonathan Clark fell asleep with a smile on his face, dreaming not of market fluctuations or property acquisitions, but of a small boy's laughter and the radical possibility that his best days might still lie ahead. But happiness, as Jonathan was about to learn, makes its own kind of target. The deeper his bond with David grew, the more visible it became to others, and not everyone viewed their unlikely friendship with the same benevolence that had allowed it to flourish. Success breeds scrutiny, and wealth attracts attention, even when the wealthy man in question desires nothing more than to fade into the background of a child's uncomplicated world. The first warning came from an unexpected source. Margaret, his longtime assistant, approached him with obvious reluctance one morning as he reviewed plans for expanding the community center's programming. "Mr. Clark, I need to discuss something sensitive with you," she began, her professional demeanor unable to mask personal concern. "Of course," Jonathan replied, setting aside the architectural drawings that had been consuming his attention. The upgraded facility would include a proper gymnasium, expanded library space, and dedicated areas for tutoring and mentoring programs, all funded by what represented pocket change to him, but would transform the lives of families like David's. "There's been talk," Margaret continued carefully. "Some of your business associates are questioning your recent activities, the amount of time you're spending in Bronzeville, the substantial donations to community organizations, your decreased focus on expanding the company's portfolio." She paused, choosing her words with diplomatic precision. "They're wondering if you're making decisions based on sound business practices or other influences." Jonathan set down his pen, giving Margaret his full attention. Her discomfort was palpable, and he realized she was trying to protect him from criticism he hadn't even been aware of receiving. "What exactly are they saying?" "That your judgment may be compromised, that you might be being manipulated by people who see an opportunity in your grief." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation waiting for a response. The implications hit Jonathan with unexpected force. His colleagues saw his friendship with David not as healing, but as vulnerability, his charitable activities not as growth, but as weakness to be exploited. The business world he dominated for decades operated on assumptions of self-interest and calculated advantage, concepts that left no room for the simple human connection that had restored his capacity for joy. "And what do you think, Margaret?" he asked quietly, curious about the opinion of someone who'd observed his transformation from the inside. She was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing her response. "I think you're the most peaceful I've seen you in 7 years, she finally said. "I think whatever's happening in your life is healing something that was broken. But I also think you need to be careful about how others perceive your friendship with this family." Her warning proved prophetic. Within days, the whispers had grown louder and more specific. Phone calls from concerned board members, casual inquiries from fellow investors, even a carefully worded article in the business section of the Tribune questioning whether Jonathan Clark's recent philanthropic surge represented sound stewardship or emotional instability following his personal losses. The scrutiny might have remained manageable if it had stayed within his professional circle, but success and controversy have a way of attracting attention from unexpected quarters. The story of a lonely millionaire, transformed by friendship with a young boy, made for compelling human interest, and soon journalists were asking questions that had nothing to do with quarterly earnings or real estate development. Maria was the first to notice the change in atmosphere around their small family. Neighbors who'd initially been pleased by the community center's improvements began asking pointed questions about her relationship with Jonathan Clark. Friends at work wondered aloud whether the wealthy businessman's interest in her son was entirely appropriate. Even the staff at David's school began treating their family with a mixture of deference and suspicion that made every interaction feel complicated. "I don't like this," she confided to Jonathan one evening as they watched David play with other children in the renovated center. "People are looking at us differently, at him differently, some of the things they're saying." She trailed off, but her meaning was clear. Jonathan felt anger rise in his chest, not at Maria's concerns, which were entirely justified, but at a world that could take something as pure as his friendship with David and twist it into something sinister. "What are they saying?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew. "That we're taking advantage of you. That David is some kind of, I don't know, con artist? Or something. That I'm using my son to get close to your money." Her voice broke slightly on the last words, the accusation clearly painful to even repeat. The idea was so absurd it would have been laughable if it weren't causing real harm to people Jonathan had come to love. David was the least calculating person he'd ever met, his love freely given without thought of return. Maria worked harder than anyone he knew, proud and independent, accepting his help only reluctantly and never asking for anything beyond what directly benefited her son and neighbors. "You know that's nonsense," he said firmly. "Anyone who spent 5 minutes with David knows he's incapable of deception." "I know," Maria replied, but her voice carried worry that went beyond public opinion. "But David doesn't understand why people are whispering about him now, why some of his friends' parents don't want them playing together anymore. He asks me if he did something wrong, and I don't know what to tell him." That night, Jonathan couldn't sleep. He paced his penthouse, moving past windows that overlooked a city where his name graced buildings and his investments influenced thousands of lives, yet where a simple friendship with a remarkable child had somehow become controversial. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent decades building a reputation as a shrewd businessman, only to find that reputation threatened by the most honest relationship of his adult life. The crisis came to a head on a rainy Thursday evening that eerily echoed the night he'd first encountered David beneath that flickering streetlight. Jonathan had planned to take David and Maria to dinner at a family restaurant they'd discovered together, a small place where the owner knew their names, and the waitress always remembered David's preference for chocolate milk. But when he arrived at their apartment, he found Maria waiting with the kind of expression that warned of difficult conversations ahead. "We need to talk," she said without preamble, her voice carrying a finality that made Jonathan's stomach clench with dread. "David was at a friend's house," she explained, giving them privacy for the conversation she'd been dreading. Inside their small apartment, the space that had become more of a home to Jonathan than his luxurious penthouse, Maria's usual warmth was replaced by protective determination. "This has to stop," she began, her words hitting him like physical blows. "The attention, the whispers, the way people look at David now, it's not fair to him. He's 8 years old. He shouldn't have to deal with adults making ugly assumptions about his friendships." Jonathan sat heavily in the chair that had become his regular spot at their dinner table, the place where he'd shared more meaningful conversations than in all his boardrooms combined. "Maria, you can't seriously be considering—" "I am," she interrupted, and he could see the pain the decision was causing her. "I've seen how happy David is with you, how much your friendship means to him. But I've also seen what happens when rich people and poor people try to mix. It never ends well for the poor people." "That's not what this is," Jonathan protested, hearing the desperation in his own voice. "You know me better than that. You know what David means to me." "I do know," Maria said, and her voice cracked slightly. "That's what makes this so hard. I think you genuinely care about him. But caring isn't enough when the whole world is watching and judging and making assumptions. David heard some kids at school calling him names yesterday, saying he was your pet or something worse. He didn't understand what they meant, but he knew it was cruel. The image of David's bright spirit dimmed by cruelty cut Jonathan deeper than any business loss ever could. This was exactly what he'd feared, what he'd tried to prevent by keeping their friendship as private as possible. But privacy was a luxury that wealth made nearly impossible to maintain. "There has to be another way," he said quietly. "I can't just walk away from him. From both of you." The admission revealed more about his emotional dependence than he'd consciously acknowledged. Maria was quiet for a long moment, tears gathering in her eyes. "Maybe if things were different, if you were just a regular person instead of Jonathan Clark, the millionaire developer, maybe then." She shrugged helplessly, But that's not reality. Your money, your reputation, your whole world. It changes everything, even when we don't want it to. As if summoned by the emotional weight of their conversation, David's voice could be heard in the hallway, his footsteps racing up the stairs with characteristic energy. Maria quickly wiped her eyes, but not quickly enough to escape her son's notice when he burst through the door. "Mr. Clark." David's face lit up with its usual joy, but his expression quickly shifted as he sensed the tension in the room. "What's wrong? Why does Mama look sad?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything Jonathan had thought he understood about love and sacrifice. Looking at David's concerned face, so young, so trusting, so utterly unaware of the adult complexities that threatened to tear apart the friendship that had saved them both, Jonathan felt his heart breaking in ways that made Elena's death seem almost manageable by comparison. "Nothing's wrong, sweetheart," Maria said, but her voice betrayed the lie even as she spoke it. David moved between them, his small hands reaching for both adults with the instinctive gesture of someone trying to hold together something that was falling apart. "We're supposed to go get pizza tonight," he said, looking back and forth between the two people who'd become the center of his world. "And Mr. Clark was going to help me with my school project about different types of trees. Simple plans, innocent expectations, the normal rhythm of a friendship that had grown beyond circumstances into something approaching family." Jonathan looked at this remarkable child who taught him to believe in goodness again, and realized that love sometimes meant letting go, even when letting go felt like dying all over again. But before he could form words around the sacrifice Maria was asking him to make, David did what David always did. He saw straight to the heart of things with devastating clarity. "You're going to stop being my friend," the boy said, not as a question but as a statement of understanding that revealed wisdom far beyond his years. "Because people are saying mean things about us being friends, okay?" Neither adult bothered to deny it. David's perception made lies impossible. "Sometimes," David continued, climbing onto Jonathan's lap with the casual intimacy that had become their norm, "people don't understand that love comes in different shapes. They think if you love someone, it has to look exactly like other love they've seen before." Jonathan's arms tightened around the small form nestled against his chest, breathing in the scent of childhood, crayons and playground dirt and innocence that couldn't be purchased at any price. "That doesn't make it fair," he whispered. "No," David agreed solemnly, "but Mama's scared, and you're scared, and when grown-ups get scared, they sometimes make choices that hurt even when they don't want to." The accuracy of the assessment was staggering. Here was an 8-year-old child faced with losing someone he loved, responding not with anger or tears, but with empathy for the adults whose fears were tearing his world apart. Jonathan had built an empire on his ability to read people's motivations and weaknesses, yet this child consistently demonstrated understanding that surpassed his own. As the evening dissolved into awkward silences and carefully avoided topics, Jonathan realized he was facing the most difficult decision of his life. Walking away would protect David from scrutiny and cruel whispers, would allow him to return to the simple happiness of childhood, unmarked by adult complexities. But it would also mean abandoning the person who'd taught him to live again, leaving behind the relationship that had restored his faith in human goodness. The rain outside continued its relentless rhythm, echoing that first night when a shivering boy had waited for God and found instead a lonely man desperately in need of saving. As Jonathan prepared to leave, possibly for the last time, he wondered if he'd learned enough about love and sacrifice to make the right choice, even when every option seemed destined to break someone's heart. David walked him to the door with unusual solemnity, his small hand clasping Jonathan's fingers with desperate strength. "Are you going to forget about me?" he asked, the first time fear had crept into his usually confident voice. "Never," Jonathan promised, kneeling to meet those amber eyes that had first seen through to his wounded soul. "Not if I live to be 1,000 years old." "Good," David said, and for just a moment his characteristic smile returned. "Because I'm going to keep praying for you every day, and prayers work better when both people remember each other." As Jonathan walked away from the apartment building that had become his sanctuary, he carried with him the weight of a choice he wasn't sure he had the strength to make. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean while leaving his heart more tangled than ever. That night, alone in his penthouse with its magnificent views and silent luxury, Jonathan found himself staring at the wall of clocks that had started ticking again thanks to David's influence. Their gentle rhythm seemed to mock him now, counting down moments of happiness that might already be over, marking time that could never be reclaimed once the decision was made. For the first time since Elena's death, Jonathan Clark faced a choice where all his wealth and power were useless, where the only currency that mattered was the courage to love despite the cost, or the wisdom to walk away while love still remained pure and uncomplicated by the harsh judgments of a world that had forgotten how to believe in miracles. The following days passed in a haze of avoidance and indecision. Jonathan threw himself into work with an intensity he hadn't felt in months, reviewing property acquisitions and investment opportunities with the kind of fierce focus that had built his empire. But concentration proved elusive. His mind kept drifting to amber eyes and gentle wisdom, to the sound of a child's laughter echoing through a renovated community center, to the warmth of a small hand trusting enough to reach for his. His business associates noted the change with approval, interpreting his renewed attention to profit margins as a return to sensible priorities. "Good to have you back," commented Richard Stevenson, his longtime partner in several major development projects, during a meeting about expanding their commercial real estate portfolio into the cryptocurrency market. That community service phase was admirable, but there's only so much charity work a serious businessman can do before people start questioning his judgment. Jonathan nodded absently, signing documents that would generate millions in revenue, while his thoughts remained focused on a boy who measured wealth in friendship and measured friendship in the simple act of remembering someone in daily prayers. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he sat, wielding financial power that could reshape entire neighborhoods, yet feeling completely powerless to protect what mattered most to him. Margaret, ever observant, noticed his distraction during their afternoon review of quarterly projections. "Are you all right, Mr. Clark? You seem—" She paused, searching for diplomatic phrasing. "Troubled by something." "Personal matters," Jonathan replied curtly, then immediately regretted his tone. Margaret had been nothing but supportive throughout his friendship with David, even when it made her job more complicated. "I'm sorry, yes. There are some personal decisions I'm working through." "Anything I can help with?" she offered, and her genuine concern reminded him why he'd trusted her with the details of his business for so many years. Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, staring at financial reports that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the meaning they held in his current state of mind. "What would you do," he asked finally, "if you had to choose between protecting someone you loved and being with them?" The question clearly caught Margaret off guard, but she considered it with the same careful attention she brought to complex business negotiations. "I suppose," she said slowly, "it would depend on what they were being protected from, and whether the protection was worth the cost of separation." Her words echoed in his thoughts as he made the drive to his penthouse that evening, past familiar neighborhoods that had taken on new meaning since David entered his life. The community center he'd helped renovate glowed with warm light, children and families moving through its doors with the easy confidence of people who knew they belonged somewhere. The site should have brought satisfaction. His investment had genuinely improved lives, created opportunities, built bridges between resources and need. Instead, it only reminded him of what he might be losing. The emptiness of his luxurious apartment felt more pronounced than ever as he moved through rooms that had briefly come alive with possibility. The wall of clocks, ticking steadily now thanks to David's influence, seemed to count down moments of happiness that were slipping away like sand through his fingers. Elena's photograph smiled at him from his desk, and for the first time in months, he found himself wondering what she would advise if she could speak. The answer, when it came, arrived not through mystical revelation, but through concrete action that forced his hand in ways he'd been too paralyzed to manage on his own. The phone rang at 10:30 that evening, Maria's voice tight with worry and something approaching panic. "Jonathan, I need your help," she said without preamble, her usual reserve shattered by maternal fear. "David collapsed at school today. They rushed him to Children's Memorial, and the doctors—" Her voice broke slightly. "They don't know what's wrong with him." The world tilted sideways. Jonathan found himself gripping the phone with trembling hands, his carefully controlled emotional barriers collapsing in the face of unthinkable possibility. What happened? What are his symptoms? High fever? Difficulty breathing? Some kind of inflammation in his chest? They're running tests, but it could be several days before they know anything definitive. Maria's voice carried the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd spent hours in hospital waiting rooms, reliving every parent's worst nightmare. "He's been asking for you, King." The simplicity of that statement, "he's been asking for you," cut through every complicated consideration that had been paralyzing Jonathan's decision-making process. A child he loved was suffering, possibly in danger, and was calling for him. Everything else became irrelevant in the face of that fundamental truth. "I'll be right there," he said, already reaching for his coat. "Jonathan," Maria's voice stopped him. "The media attention, the whispers about our friendship, none of that matters right now. If he needs you, I need you there too." The hospital corridors felt familiar in the worst possible way, bringing back memories of another night, 7 years earlier, when he'd walked similar halls waiting for news that would reshape his understanding of loss. But this was different, not just because David was a child with so much life still ahead of him, but because this time Jonathan wasn't facing the crisis alone. Maria's determined strength beside him, her fierce maternal love providing anchor in uncertainty, reminded him that some battles were meant to be fought together. David looked impossibly small in the hospital bed, surrounded by machines that monitored his vital signs with the same cold efficiency that had once tracked Elena's failing systems. But where Elena had been still and unreachable in her final days, David's eyes were alert and aware, lighting up with genuine joy when he saw Jonathan enter the room. "I knew you'd come," the boy said, his voice weakened by illness, but still carrying that characteristic certainty that had first captured Jonathan's attention. "I told the nurses that my best friend would be here soon." Best friend. Two simple words that carried weight beyond any business contract Jonathan had ever signed, any investment return he'd ever achieved. This child, facing illness with the same grace he'd shown while standing in a storm, considered a wealthy businessman his best friend, not because of what money could buy, but because of what presence and attention and genuine caring had built between them. Jonathan pulled a chair close to the bed, taking David's small hand in his own, and feeling the fever that burned through the child's delicate system. "How are you feeling, buddy?" "Tired," David admitted, "but better now that you're here. The doctor says they need to do more tests to figure out what's making me sick, but I'm not scared." He paused, studying Jonathan's face with those wise amber eyes. "Are you scared?" Honesty felt like the only appropriate response to such direct questioning. "Yes," Jonathan said quietly, "I'm terrified." "Pain," David nodded solemnly, as if this admission made perfect sense to him. "Mama's scared too, but I told her that being scared just means we love each other a lot, and love is always worth being scared about." 8 years old, facing medical uncertainty with philosophical acceptance that surpassed most adults' capacity for grace under pressure, Jonathan felt tears gathering in his eyes as he recognized again the profound gift that David's friendship represented, not just the healing it had brought to his own wounded heart, but the constant reminder that wisdom and strength often came in unexpected packages. The next few days blurred together in a rhythm of waiting and hoping, of medical consultations and test results that revealed more questions than answers. Jonathan barely left the hospital, conducting business meetings via phone from uncomfortable waiting room chairs, reviewing investment portfolios on his laptop between trips to David's bedside. His usual concerns about productivity and profit margins felt absurdly insignificant when measured against a child's struggle for health. Maria watched this transformation with growing amazement. The wealthy businessman who'd initially seemed so removed from her world had embraced the unglamorous reality of hospital vigils with complete dedication, bringing coffee for overwhelmed nurses, reading stories aloud when David felt well enough to listen, maintaining hopeful conversation even when his own fear was clearly overwhelming. "You don't have to stay," she told him during one of their quiet conversations in the hallway outside David's room. "I know you have important business to handle." "There's nothing more important than this," Jonathan replied without hesitation. Nothing more important than him. The crisis peaked on a Tuesday evening when David's fever spiked dangerously high and his breathing became labored. Medical staff moved with urgent efficiency, while Jonathan and Maria waited in helpless terror, clinging to each other for support as machines and medications fought the mysterious illness threatening the most precious person in both their worlds. It was during those dark hours, as they sat in uncomfortable plastic chairs listening to the sounds of medical intervention, that Jonathan made a decision that had been building since the first night he'd encountered a shivering child in a Chicago storm. "When he gets better," he said quietly, his voice carrying absolute conviction rather than hopeful uncertainty, "I want to adopt him." Maria's tired eyes widened with surprise, but before she could respond, Jonathan continued speaking, his words tumbling out with the urgency of thoughts too long suppressed. "Not legally, necessarily, unless that's something you'd want, but emotionally, spiritually, I want him to be my son in every way that matters. I want to help raise him, support his dreams, be there for every important moment from now until I'm too old to remember my own name." The proposition was unprecedented, challenging every conventional understanding of family and relationship and appropriate boundaries between different social worlds. But watching this man, she'd initially distrusted, demonstrate unwavering devotion to her child's well-being, Maria found herself considering possibilities she'd never imagined. "What about the gossip?" she asked. "The business associates who think you've lost your judgment? The newspapers that might make this into some kind of scandalous story?" Jonathan's response came without hesitation. "Let them talk. Let them write whatever they want. David is worth more than their good opinion, worth more than any business reputation or social standing. He's taught me what matters, and what matters is love. Not the kind that looks good in newspapers, but the kind that shows up in hospital waiting rooms and stays until morning." As if summoned by their conversation, a doctor appeared with the first genuinely encouraging news they'd received in days. The mysterious illness was responding to treatment. David's fever had broken, his breathing was improving, and barring any unexpected complications, he should be able to go home within the week. The relief was overwhelming, flooding through Jonathan's system like a physical force that left him weak and grateful, and more convinced than ever that he'd found his true purpose. When they returned to David's room and found the boy sitting up slightly, managing a weak but genuine smile, Jonathan felt something shift permanently in his understanding of what legacy meant. "I heard you talking in the hallway," David said, his voice still weak but carrying unmistakable mischief. "Did you really tell Mama you want to adopt me?" The directness of the question shouldn't have surprised Jonathan. David had never been one for indirect communication, but it still caught him off guard. "Would that be okay with you?" he asked, suddenly uncertain about a decision he'd felt absolutely confident making just minutes earlier. David's response was immediate and decisive. "I've been praying for a daddy for as long as I can remember," he said simply. "I just never thought God would send me one who was already rich and could help so many people." The word "daddy" hit Jonathan with emotional force that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. In all his imaginings about what relationship he might have with David, he'd never quite allowed himself to think in terms of actual fatherhood, actual family, actual belonging to something larger and more meaningful than individual success. "Are you sure?" he asked. Needed confirmation that this remarkable child truly understood what he was offering. "I'm sure," David said, reaching for Jonathan's hand with the same trusting gesture that had characterized their friendship from its beginning. "But can we still call you Mr. Clark sometimes? I like how fancy it sounds." The request was so typically David, accepting profound change while maintaining the small details that brought him joy, that Jonathan found himself laughing through tears he no longer tried to hide. "You can call me whatever makes you happy," he promised. That night, as David slept peacefully for the first time in days, and Maria dozed in the uncomfortable chair beside his bed, Jonathan stood at the hospital window, looking out at Chicago's glittering skyline. His name still graced buildings throughout the city. His investments still generated wealth beyond most people's imagination. His business empire still represented decades of strategic planning and calculated risk-taking. But for the first time in his adult life, those achievements felt like supporting actors rather than the main story. The main story was sleeping in a hospital bed behind him, an 8-year-old boy who'd taught a lonely millionaire that the richest life was one filled with love given freely, received gratefully, and shared without reservation. When David came home from the hospital, it wasn't just to his small apartment with Maria, but to an expanded definition of family that included a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan and a man whose frozen heart had learned to beat again. The transition wasn't without its challenges: lawyers to consult, social workers to satisfy, public relations consultants to manage the media attention that inevitably followed such an unusual arrangement. But through all the adult complications, David adapted with the same grace he'd shown to every other change in his young life. He moved between two homes with easy comfort, equally at ease coloring at his small table in Maria's kitchen, or doing homework in Jonathan's study surrounded by financial reports and investment portfolios. The boy who'd once waited for God in a Chicago storm had somehow managed to bridge two very different worlds, bringing them together in ways that created something richer than either could have achieved alone. 6 months later, on a mild spring evening that carried the promise of summer warmth, Jonathan sat in the community center he'd helped transform, watching David play with neighborhood children on equipment that represented far more than his financial contribution could measure. The space hummed with life: teenagers studying at new computers, elderly residents playing chess by the windows, young mothers watching their toddlers negotiate playground equipment with developing confidence. Maria joined him on the bench, settling beside him with the comfortable familiarity of someone who'd become more than co-parent, someone who'd become genuine friend and partner in the complex project of raising an extraordinary child. "He looks happy," she observed, watching David organize some elaborate game that seemed to involve equal parts imagination and negotiation. "He looks like himself," Jonathan replied, recognizing in the boy's animated gestures and bright laughter the same spirit that had first captured his attention on a rainy night that seemed like a lifetime ago. The transformation hadn't been limited to David's circumstances, of course. Jonathan's penthouse now showed signs of actual habitation. Children's books mixed with financial journals on coffee tables, colorful artwork sharing wall space with expensive paintings, the sounds of laughter and conversation replacing years of careful silence. Even his business practices had evolved, with community impact becoming as important as profit margins, social responsibility weighing equally with shareholder returns. His colleagues had initially viewed these changes with skepticism, waiting for Jonathan to return to familiar patterns of purely profit-driven decision-making. But as months passed and his modified approach continued generating strong returns while also creating positive community impact, skepticism gave way to curious interest. Several had asked about his methods, genuinely wanting to understand how social consciousness could coexist with sound business practices. "You seem different," Richard Stevenson had commented during their most recent partnership meeting. I don't know how to put it. More like you're enjoying the work instead of just executing it." The observation was accurate. For the first time in his career, Jonathan approached business challenges with energy that came from purpose rather than mere ambition. Knowing that his success could directly benefit families like the ones he'd come to know through David created motivation that went beyond personal achievement or financial accumulation. As evening settled over the community center and families began gathering their children for the journey home, David bounded over to the bench where Maria and Jonathan waited with the patient attention of adults who'd learned that childhood energy operates on its own schedule. "Can we get ice cream on the way home?" he asked. The question directed to both parents with the casual assumption of someone who'd never doubted his right to make such requests. "Which home?" Maria asked, smiling at the complexity that had become routine in their expanded family structure. David considered this with characteristic seriousness. "You're home tonight because I want to help you make pancakes in the morning. But Mr. Clark's home tomorrow night because he promised to help me with my project about different kinds of businesses." The easy way he moved between households, claiming both as equally his own, never ceased to amaze Jonathan. This child, who'd once stood in a storm waiting for divine intervention, had created his own miracle, weaving together unlikely elements into something stronger and more beautiful than anyone could have planned. As they walked toward the car, David's small hand finding its way into Jonathan's with the unconscious gesture of complete trust, Jonathan found himself thinking about the wall of clocks in his penthouse. They all ticked steadily now, marking moments of genuine happiness rather than counting down time until some distant resolution of grief. Elena's photograph still held place of honor on his desk, but it no longer represented an ending. Instead, it reminded him that love could transform itself, could find new expressions and unexpected recipients without diminishing what had come before. The drive through Chicago's familiar streets felt different now, not the aimless wandering of a man trying to fill empty hours, but the purposeful journey of someone traveling toward home, toward family, toward the daily small miracles of shared meals and bedtime stories and conversations about everything from playground politics to the mysteries of faith. That night, after David had been tucked into bed with promises of pancakes and project assistance, Jonathan stood once again at his penthouse windows, looking out over the city he'd helped build. The view hadn't changed, the same skyline of steel and glass, the same grid of streets carrying lives and stories and dreams through the urban landscape. But his perspective on what he was seeing had been fundamentally altered by the experience of loving and being loved by a child who taught him that the most valuable investments couldn't be measured in dollars or percentages. His phone buzzed with market updates and investment notifications, the constant stream of information that kept his financial empire productive and growing. Bitcoin values, real estate acquisitions, international market fluctuations, all the data that had once consumed his attention now felt like background noise to the more important business of family dinners and school projects and community involvement. As he prepared for sleep in a home that finally felt alive with possibility rather than haunted by loss, Jonathan Clark realized that the story wasn't ending but beginning. The shivering boy who'd waited for God in a Chicago storm had indeed been visited by something divine, not in the form of supernatural intervention, but in the very human miracle of connection, understanding, and love that transcended every boundary that should have kept them apart. The frozen clocks had started ticking again, marking not just the passage of time, but the accumulation of moments that mattered, memories that enriched rather than haunted, hope that grew stronger rather than dimmer with each passing day. Some fortunes, Jonathan had learned, could only be measured in the wealth of relationships, the dividend of daily kindness, the compound interest of love given and received without reservation. And you? Have you ever met someone small who changed your life in an immense way? Have you discovered that the greatest treasures aren't stored in banks or portfolios, but in the simple courage to open your heart to unexpected friendship? Tell me your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart the way David touched Jonathan's, leave a like and subscribe, so this message can reach another soul who needs to remember that miracles still happen, not always in the ways we expect, but always in the ways we need most. Sometimes the richest life isn't measured in what we accumulate, but in what we're brave enough to give away, and wise enough to receive in return.